All right, the year's winding down. The holiday slowdown season is just around the corner, but temperatures aren't the only thing that's dropping. So are our boot camp prices. Don't let yourself get pulled into the holiday cookies on the couch downtime just yet, because Cyberwork listeners will get $500 off most live online boot camps through the end of the year. If you're looking to land your first cybersecurity job, maybe you'll consider earning your Security Plus certification. This can be your first big stepping stone in your cybersecurity journey. And if you want to really make your resume stand out in the pile, you might want to earn your CISSP. That's one heck of a leg up. You're going to be holding the most requested certification in cybersecurity job listings in the US at the moment. But whatever your career goals, we have training for you. We've got certs from CompTIA, ISACA, ISC Squared, EC Council, Cisco, Microsoft, and more. And keep watching this channel through the end of the year, because in the middle of each episode, I'll be showing you around some of the offerings in some of our top boot camps so that you can see what you would be learning on your path to certification, and it becomes a little more real for you. All right, look, the best gift you can give to future you of 2024 is taking decisive action now and smashing holiday season malaise with the gift of certification. Book an upcoming course before December 31st, 2023 and save $500 on your live online bootcamp training. And just when you thought gift giving season was over, well, okay, I'll give you one more. Your training comes with an exam pass guarantee. Now, that means if you don't pass your exam on the first attempt, we'll provide a second attempt at no extra cost to you. I mean, come on. So don't snooze. Take decisive action in your career. Go to infosecinstitute.com/free to learn more. Again, that's infosecinstitute.com/free and book your next certification bootcamp today. Now, don't worry about it. Don't overthink about it. And don't let the last couple of months of 2023 go on cruise control. Trust me, you are ready right now. But are you ready for today's episode of Cyberwork? Well, I hope so, because here it comes now. Today on Cyberwork, I'm happy to welcome Anna Claiborne from Zayo to talk about the spike of DDoS attacks they have seen in the past year. Although distributed denial of service attacks trend up nearly every year, new factors around advanced automation and ease of use may be driving this increase. Anna takes us back 20 years, back when solutions to DDoS attacks involved trying to find the most far-out solutions you could, often for the most far-out clients you could imagine. Seriously, I use the words Wild West to describe early security in a lot of these episodes, but Anna really gives us some top-notch war stories. She'll also let you know where to focus if you want to get started in telecom security or any of the near-infinite industries that would be impacted by telecom shutting down. That's all today on Cyberwork. Welcome to this week's episode of the Cyberwork with Infosec podcast. Each week, we talk with a different industry thought leader about cybersecurity trends, the way those trends affect the work of Infosec professionals, while offering tips for breaking in or moving up the ladder in the cybersecurity industry. A software engineering executive with a product focus, my guest, Anna Claiborne, serves as Zayo Group's SVP of Packet and Product Software Engineering, where she leads product management for the company's network connectivity products. She also held key roles in building multiple companies from zero to cash flow positive, including a CTO and co-founder of Packet Fabric. Anna is a hands-on creator of services who can effortlessly switch between authoring a board presentation and coding a prototype. That's exactly the type of guest we like to have on here. So she has created solutions in a spectrum of industries, including retail, managed security services, DDoS mitigation, WAN networking, internet infrastructure, DNS, and banking. So Anna contacted me because Zayo has released a report recently about a meteoric rise in distributed denial of service attacks or DDoS attacks, and how AI and automation has allowed this to occur. So we're going to find out a little bit about that. So Anna, thank you so much for joining me today, and welcome to Cyberwork.
Of course, Chris. Thanks for having me here. I'm excited for our conversation.
Me as well. So, today I want to bring our listeners up to speed about you and your cybersecurity journey. We told them a little bit there in the bio, but what was your earliest interest in computers and tech? Could you point to an initial spark or a moment of excitement that started you down this path?
Sure. So there's actually two that, if I think back, were kind of maybe those initial spark points. I played Oregon Trail and had an Apple IIe and played all those great old video games.
Yep.
And I think one point was for my birthday. My dad got me a sound card for our computer, and I was like, "What and the name is this. I was like,
Yeah.
it was the least exciting gift I had ever received. I was like, what? I was like, really? Like, what is this? And so we installed it. And back in the day when you had like mess with IRQs, it was a pain.
Yep.
But anyway, then I started playing, because I was playing Doom at the time. I started playing it and I was like, oh, wow, it has sound. I was like, okay, maybe this is actually pretty cool. Not such a bad gift after all. So, it's like that first time, like first making that connection between like, this like piece of hardware will actually do something interesting. And the second time was probably like when I first started using like just MS-DOS to write reports. And I think I did my first book report around 10th grade in it. And I learned that it had a spell check module. I think you could actually load from like a separate floppy disk. And because I was a horrible speller, always got, like knocked off for my spelling. And I was like, okay, the computer can do something super functional for me. It can check all my spelling. And so now I still am an awful speller because I learned to do this way too early in my life. And so I never learned how to spell anything.
No, I think like all of these things, people, endlessly complain that, oh, no one knows how to get directions anymore without your phone or whatever. But like, that's the good part of it, is that you don't have to do these things anymore. You can free your brain up for other things, so.
Exactly. And like, that's how I feel about spelling. My brain can spend time on other things.
Certain things just are never going to come. I have terrible handwriting and I always will. And that's fine because now I type everything.
See, and that, like, I bet once you realize like, oh, the computer will save me from ever having to, like have somebody complain about my handwriting. It feels like I
do cursive to write checks and never. That's it. Those are the two times. So, well, that's great. That's also, I think that's interesting to hear too, because it gives me a sense of what your initial relationship to tech was, which was, I'm not sure about this, but once I figure out this specific application for it, I can see the benefit of it. Whereas, we've also had guests who just like the idea of like breaking a thing and putting it back together, or people who just came to it later in life. So you have this sort of middle ground here where you're like, okay, it's a tool and I need to know how to refine this tool to make it do what I want it to do, which is another valid path, I think. So,
I'm highly practical and I like what technology can do rather than technology for the sake of it. But I love what technology can do.
Yeah, you're not hanging out in the guts of the machine just because you find them interesting. It's more like, okay, once we put it all back together, now it should hopefully do the thing I want it to do better.
Yep.
There we go. All right. So, so I like to look back on people's, career journeys through LinkedIn and some of your, online presence and stuff. So look through your past positions and your career journey. As you said in the bio, you have a lot of experience in software engineering and pen testing and remediation, as well as product management, as well as co-founding a company, which you recently departed when you joined Zayo Group. Am I pronouncing that right? Zayo Group?
Yes, okay. Zayo.
Just want to make sure. I usually ask beforehand and I totally forgot. Can you give me give me a through line of some of these interests and experiences you had in your past positions that moved you to where you are now? And like, what was it about each of these things that gave you the experiences or the emphases or skills you needed to succeed where you are now?
Sure. So, I think it's, as you said, my initial relationship with computers, what can they functionally do for you? That really spurred my interest in software engineering. And that is what I got a minor in computer science in college, and that was all software courses, because to me, that was the ultimate of, where the rubber meets the road. Software is how you make computers do cool tricks and how you actually make them do something functional for you. So I was definitely not on the hardware side. I was on the software side, and because that's where you can make computers do all the neat things. Yeah. And that was my start. I did actually though start working at a bank prior to that, doing networking. And that was just sort of more of a practical thing because I needed a job, and I knew about computers because I had been working on them, and so I was doing a lot of the networking and telecom actually for a bank. So I was working on like keeping up all the frame relay, SDN lines, like managing those, configuring little Cisco routers. But that was to me, that was just very, practical, because you weren't actually like creating anything or making any experience better. You were just keeping things going. And so I think that actually that dynamic provided kind of almost for the rest of my career in a very odd way, because I went off to work on, I worked at Tower doing, software engineer, worked on their website, which at the time, towerrecords.com was actually their highest grossing store. This was back when people still thought their websites were stores. And so it was the highest grossing store in the empire. And then after that, the first company that I started was Prolexic, which was DDoS attack mitigation.
Okay. Oh, so you've been with DDoS the whole time here then. Yeah. This is a personal interest. Yeah.
It's woven in and out of the storyline here, in and out of my life. And this was back in 2003 when DDoS was still a relatively, juvenile sort of industry in a lot of ways. And there was no commercial DDoS attack mitigation services. There was a few products, hardware products, but there were no services. And so this was a little bit of a first of its kind type of thing. And it was actually the Costa Rican gaming companies that needed it. And they're the ones who initially financed us. Yes, we got a big bucket of cash from them.
Who was attacking the Costa Rican gaming companies? Do you have a sense of that, or
the Russian mafia?
Oh, of course. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Because so they were
big
running
fish, much bigger fish. Yeah.
Much bigger fish. Yeah, exactly. Because the Costa Rican gaming companies were a mafia in their own sense. And so they had the much larger sharks attacking them basically for extortion, because if you shut down one of the big sites down there, BetChris at the time, that was one of the originals that we worked with. You shut them down for a minute before Super Bowl. I mean, that's millions of dollars that they're losing.
Right.
And so when you shut down a site like that, and give them, pay, so you send an alternative to pay, it's a pretty straight up extortion sort of tactic.
Yes.
And they figured out that they could hit, a lot of the smaller gaming companies had actually paid them. So they figured out it was a pretty lucrative business. And so that was our first batch of customers, which expanded over to like the UK gaming. We ran into a lot of online retailers actually that were having issues, ticked off customers. And then from there, it really exploded into, we were working with banks, insurance companies. That was like the high growth years for DDoS, was like that 2003 to 2008 timeframe, because people were really, realizing the utility of DDoS and exacting revenge or extortion.
There wasn't a quick fix at that point. Yeah.
There wasn't a quick fix. And so it was highly utilitarian. In fact, one of the most interesting, there's a lot of interesting stuff I worked on, but one of the more interesting things was an insurance company who had been under a chronic DDoS attack for, it was over a year at the time, and it was so disruptive and the traffic was growing. So it was a worm that had an exploit in the Windows operating system, and it had been spreading, and it was targeted just at this insurance company. Wow. And so it was one of the ones that we tracked jointly with a European government agency. And we actually did track the guy down. We tracked a lot of attackers. That was kind of part of the early Cowboy West, is we're just like, hey, we think we can figure out who this person is.
Yeah.
And try to do it. Yeah.
Wow.
And so we tracked this person down, and he was an ex-employee. Felt very wronged by the company.
Yes. Interesting.
Yeah. And so it was a classic case of revenge. And so very interesting.
So we're talking about a 20-year span here that you've had your hand in DDoS remediation in some form or another, on and off. I realize you've been doing other things as well, but can you talk about what have the solutions changed at all? When someone said, they got DDoSed in 2003 versus now, is there a different set of, a different flow chart of what do we do first? What do we do second? Or are you still kind of working from a lot of the same playbook?
It's one of those, the more things change, the more they stay the same. There have been substantial changes. To highlight, what are the substantial changes, is that everything is far more automated than it was back in 2003.
For sure.
We were just there was some pieces of hardware that did very specific sort of DDoS attack mitigation, but for the most part, we had to build a lot of our own mitigation, especially for like layer 7 type attacks, so application attacks. We had to set up like a big reverse proxy bank to basically filter web requests that had we would look for some header on them, or some specific something upon which we could block the request. There was nothing at the time that existed that could do that sort of filtering. So we built our own solution completely for mitigating simpler things like SYN floods, which is just a huge inbound bunch of SYN packets, which is the first packet in the TCP handshake. There was equipment that would do that automatically and fairly well. So, it was a mixture of all these different things, and we had to sort of look at the attack and figure out, what path do we send it in our network to get mitigated correctly. So it was a lot of manual and then automating those steps, which is a lot of what I did, which was figuring out the higher level, like the application attack defense, and then figuring out how do we actually automate our network to make this happen. And now you have appliances that will mitigate attacks through layer 7, all on their own. They don't need to be told anything. So by that means it's way more sophisticated, but at the same time, the attacks have grown more sophisticated as well.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask. So obviously the fact that this is still a viable attack strategy suggests to me that like we have not come to a set it and forget it sort of system where they just don't get through the field. So I guess to start with here, can you sort of maybe as much of a 101 course as you can sort of talk about how a DDoS works for our listeners, but also like, especially now, like what are the sort of like, attack and counterattack, or, the sort of like negation that you're doing, like what's going on in there, and how has that escalation sort of like occurred, especially, in the recent years?
Sure. So for like the DDoS 101, basically what a DDoS is it's a flood of invalid traffic to a website, so a web server, and that blocks any legitimate traffic from getting through. One of the classic, really old school examples is if you have a phone operator sitting there, answering calls, trying to connect, and all of a sudden 1,000 people call that single phone operator just as prank calls and are just like, ha ha, and like hang up. The legitimate person who's trying to make a legitimate call and get through is never going to, because she's going to be flooded by all of these illegitimate calls and spend all of her time answering people who laugh and hang up. And so that's that's like the very like cool old school example where you get to picture someone sitting there and
the old phone freakers. Yeah, right.
Switching around lines and everything on a big switchboard. And so, what that means in terms of actual, internet technology is that either just a single packet, like, which is, just one unit of information that's sent over the network, that can be sent, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, millions of times, and just prevent a web server from ever establishing an initial connection.
Yep.
Or it can be a higher layer type of attack where you're actually sending something that looks like an HTTP get, a GET request for a web page, but it's just a bot doing it. It's not a legitimate user. So the server's wasting, again, just all of its resources answering all of these fake requests for like a home page, and the legitimate servers never actually see the home page.
Right.
Or the login page or whatever it is.
Instead of 1,000 phone callers going ha ha and hanging up, now there's tens of thousands of robots going ha ha and hanging up the
or sitting there and going, so can you connect me to and taking like a much longer.
What do I want?
Let me think about this.
Interesting. Okay, and so now. Like you said, you were able to sort of now when you were making these sort of custom filters to take care of these things for Costa Rican gaming companies and others, like, was this a fairly new solution that you were coming up with? Was this something proprietary that you invented, and also was it something sort of patentable, or was it something that everyone was kind of doing in their own way, but similarly in other places?
No, and I mean, of course, this is this is survivor biased, or the view of somebody who did
who was in
history.
Yeah.
But at the time, there was a couple companies, like the ones that you actually recognize today. Radware was in its very infancy, and they're kind of a well-known Radware and Arbor. Arbor didn't even really exist yet when we started. Radware was getting out their first appliances, and they weren't any good. They didn't do anything. There's some that were dead. Like the Top Layer was one of the vendors back then that I don't know what ever happened to them, but I don't believe they're around, and they got acquired or something along the way.
Right.
So it was a very small cohort of hardware vendors that were doing something. And in terms of service provider, there just wasn't any. Like, there was no service. You couldn't call anybody if you had a DDoS attack going and be like, fix this. That just didn't exist. We were the first of that. And so a lot of this was just, we were really making it up as we went.
Which, I've had plenty of guests on who said that was really a lot of fun to be in that kind of Wild West, anything goes, outlaw.
So much fun.
Yeah. And just, like if you were one step ahead of the other person, like you were really like way out there at that point. One step ahead was like, could have been like the end of the stratosphere or something like that,
Oh yeah. And that's how I mentioned we got to track down a lot of these attackers. It's just because we were like, well, we think we can do this. And at the time, it was all about finding the IRC server, which was controlling the botnet, which for anyone who doesn't know what IRC was, it's like the prehistoric version of Slack now. And so it's all about tracking, that down and figuring out who was actually running this botnet and then getting to know them. The Russian extortion ring was actually taken down by my coworker.
Wow.
He found the controlling server. In this case, like there was other ones that I had found, which I can tell you about those if you want. He found the controlling server.
Over a beer sometime, we'll definitely do that. Sounds great.
Yeah, and gotten this guy to give up his actual real name, which was and so that's how. And so Interpol was involved. It was a big deal.
Holy cow.
And yeah.
Okay, no, actually, you got to tell me about that. That sounds too good.
Yeah. So at any rate, found his real name, tracked down, his address, actually where he lived. And then, we worked pretty extensively with the FBI. And so since this was Russia, Interpol got involved and went and arrested him, which is kind of, this is back in the infancy, more or less, of cyber crimes. And it's really a shame that he was the one arrested, because he was ultimately just a kid doing, he was working for the Russian mafia in service of much higher up bosses. So why they didn't use him to shake down anyone larger, I think at the time there was just too much of a gap of understanding there.
You arrested a dealer on the corner rather than the supplier. Yeah.
Precisely. Yeah. They're arresting. Okay. Yes. They were arrested. So it's very immature. So they were arresting dealers on the corner. And it was just, kind of a bummer, because he was our age.
Didn't necessarily know how to escalate it. Okay. That's interesting, because one of my recent guests, Lily Infante, she, worked for, the government for 10 years and took down Lazarus Group and helped to and whatever. And she was saying that like these cybercrime networks are so decentralized now that like they couldn't report someone above them because they don't actually know who they're working for. Whereas it sounds like back here, they probably, had they known better, they could have said, who's your boss or whatever, or coerced or something and gotten something out of it.
Yeah, he might not have given them up anyway, but it just, I don't know. For me, it was very conflicting emotions, because it's like, well, here's somebody the same age as us who has, almost the same background, only we're on one side and they're on the other. And maybe if we'd been born in Russia, we'd be doing what he is doing right now. We didn't have other opportunities. So it was, it was very, very interesting.
We may have to come back and just talk old war stories here, but I want to get back to DDoS in the present day. But also, I want to get to a little bit about yourself here. So, For listeners who are sort of, window shopping our episodes for future, career directions, can you walk our listeners through some common activities and responsibilities you oversee as Senior Vice President of Packet and Product Service Engineering for Zayo? Because that's a very specific job title, and I'm curious what an average week looks like for you.
Sure. So an average week right now looks like for me looking over all of the products in the Packet portfolio. So that's DIA, Internet. It's all of the Ethernet products, MPLS. So dealing with any issues that there may be, whether it's in the quoting of those products, the implementation of those products, the customer experience with those products, the customer support. So it's really the somebody who owns a product line. It's almost like a mini CEO position where you are basically responsible for that entire product line, both in terms of P&L, so that's profit and loss, as well as the technology involved in that product line and creating a good customer experience. So it's a lot of responsibility in that position.
And once again, you're right in that middle point between you're interfacing directly with the clients, but it sounds like you also still have a lot of hands-on in terms of packet analysis and stuff like that, or like the actual sort of get your hands dirty type work. And is that a balance that you've tried to deliberately sort of keep in your life?
I would say that I try to always keep myself hands-on. A lot of people certainly don't when they reach this level, because there's an unending amount of, vendors to manage and, just issues that are always around. So you have to make a very conscious effort to stay doing something. Like, I love to dive into a problem and still write code. Like Python's pretty much all I write now, but to write some code to do something or get deeply involved with a technical issue and understand it. But you definitely have to make a conscious effort to do that at this level, because it's easy to just get caught up in the day-to-day survival. Yeah.
Now, is that something that you specifically requested or pushed for? Is that you wanted, if I'm going to move into this position, I need to still have this sort of practical side of it? And how do you feel that affects your sort of the other part of your work?
The great thing about it is that, once you get to a certain level, it's really about deciding, you're the one who sets the tone for your day. And so the best advice that somebody gave me quite a while ago was the most valuable thing that you have is your time. Yeah. So you have to protect it to do the things that, you want to do. So I block out hours during the day of like focus time that I can work on whatever I'd like. And so it's really up to me. It is, and I kind of believe all of life is a choose your own adventure. And so I choose to stay, I choose to do these things. I like still problem solving. I like still doing code. So I make time to do it, otherwise the job would quickly, it would lose a lot of its fun and attraction, and I'd probably be a lot less happy.
Hey, Cyberwork listeners, it's me, Chris. I'm just going to jump into this episode for a moment to remind you that if you book a live online bootcamp from Infosec by December 31st, 2023, you'll get $500 off the price. No promo code needed. Just book your bootcamp before the end of this year, and it'll be $500 off the normal price. So as you've been hearing in this episode, Anna Claiborne came up during the Wild West days of cybersecurity, and applying fixes to DDoS attacks was something that you did in any way you could to get the job done. Now there's certain methods that one can learn to remediate DDoS attacks, and you can learn those methods with the most popular security certification in the world. Of course, I'm talking about the Security Plus certification. So I'm just going to take a moment to pull up our bootcamp page here and show you what you'll be learning in the Security Plus, because I thought it might be of some interest to you. So here is the website for the CompTIA Security Plus Training Bootcamp from Infosec. So here's some general overview information and who should attend. But what I really want you to know is what is included in the bootcamp here. So we get a 90-day extended access to bootcamp components, including class recordings, in case you want to, keep your keep learning, and sort of if you're a sort of person that learns by repetition. There's 100% satisfaction guarantee. We mentioned the exam pass guarantee at the start. If you don't pass on the first try, we'll give you a second one at no extra charge to you. You get the exam voucher, so you're going to be taking the test right at the end of your 4-day boot camp on the 5th day. And also a nice bonus, a free 90-day Infosec skills subscription. And this includes access to 1,400 plus additional courses and labs, including hands-on cyber ranges and labs. And I had a hand in sourcing some of these from some of our professors, and these are really a lot of fun. They're little simulations of real lab situations, and you can actually go in there and tinker and break things and put them back together to your heart's content. So so for your prerequisites, we ask that you have roughly 12 to 24 months of experience working in information systems and networking before enrolling in the Security Plus. So you should have a little sense of how all this stuff goes together. But so here's what happens. So on day one, we start right off with threats, attacks, and vulnerabilities, including social engineering techniques, types of attack, applications. So you're already looking at what's going to be coming in at you, including DDoS attacks. I'm sure that's in there somewhere. So in the morning and afternoon, you get an extended look at these one topics. And then in the evening, you can do optional group or individual studies if you feel like you need to reiterate certain things or make sure that you're understanding them correctly. You can take the evening sessions as well and make sure that everything is exactly right in your head. So day two, we look at the big picture, architecture and design, including security concepts and cloud and virtualization, resilience and physical security. So this is basically getting you also on the sort of path to the more extensive CISSP certification, but basically you're looking at security as this whole ecosystem on day two. And that's going to go through the afternoon. And again, in the evenings, you can do optional group and individual study. Day three is implementation. And this is where I think the rubber really hits the road, because you're going to be taking these concepts and you're going to learn how to implement them in safe ways, including secure protocols, wireless security, network architecture concepts, mobile device security, iCloud or cloud and virtualization solutions. So this is the point where you start to actually see what the process of securing a system and a network looks like. And again, that goes through the whole day into the afternoon. You can do individual or group studies in the evening. And here's where we really get into the sort of DDoS thick of things, operation and incident response. You're going to learn network reconnaissance and discovery, following incident response procedures, disaster recovery and continuity of operation, sources for investigation, and so forth. And then in the afternoon, governance, risk, and compliance. Now, we've had a couple of GRC courses on cyber work in the past, and I hope you'll check those out as well, because that's a very good related track for people who are interested in keeping networks secure in a more sort of framework-based thing. So at the end of that, you've gone for 4 days. You're going to be doing your group or individual study in the evening as suits you. And then here we come day 5. First thing, you get right up, you turn your computer on, and it's the SYO 601 overview. We're going to show you what the exam looks like. And then we're going to give you Infosec's Security Plus SYO 601 exam cram. So if you feel like you had 4 days worth of material sloshing around in your head and you don't know where to start, the exam cram is going to give you all of the key points that you're going to absolutely need to know. Then comes afternoon session, get yourself a nice lunch at home or whatever, and take the SYO 601 exam. And with any luck, by later on, you will be getting the good news about the fact that you've passed the Security Plus certification. So this is all just to give you a sense of what kind of things happen with the Security Plus bootcamp from Infosec. So it's just a reminder that remediating DDoS attacks needs to happen fast, and a big part of that speed is having the knowledge of a Security Plus certification in hand. So to get ready for this challenge, go to infosecinstitute.com/free and browse the live online boot camps. Register before December 31st, 2023, and your cost is $500 off. All right, now back to the show. Yeah. I've had a recent guest say that, when talking about taking on younger mentor-mentee relationships, that leadership is ultimately a very lonely place to be. Like, you might have a lot of employees, but you are ultimately sort of in this sort of tower of silence up there, unless you find other ways to sort of break out and do, like you said, do the things that re-energize you. Obviously, there's certain things that need to get done to keep a business working, but I'm glad to hear that you've sort of found this out for yourself.
Yeah. It's something that I would encourage everybody to focus on. You have to, you are responsible for your own happiness. Nobody else is. So.
Yep. Yep. So for today's episode of the podcast, we're going to be looking at some data and statistics that Zayo has reported regarding the reemergence of DDoS attacks. We've been talking about those for the whole time here. According to your findings, DDoS attacks have skyrocketed between the start of 2022 and the start of 2023, like just by an astronomical number. So, Anna, what are some of the main reasons why you think that DDoS attacks have risen so massively over year recently? Are there we've seen certain things recede a little bit. I feel like ransomware is not necessarily as huge as it was a couple of months ago or a year ago, but why have DDoS's come back so strongly, do you think?
Well, first, DDoS attacks really are always on the rise. I mean, there is always a year-over-year increase in them.
Is there?
So
okay, good.
Yeah. So even though it seems like really dramatic, it's one of those things where there is. I cannot think of I don't know of a time in history when DDoS attacks have dropped. Like that's just not a thing. They've always been, they've always had a steady increase. And even if there was an off year somewhere, if you look over like even a 5-year or a 10-year time frame, you'll always see a big jump. So that just tells you, that they're always up and to the right. They've got a good trajectory.
But this last year, it sounds like it was a bigger jump than usual. Is that correct? Or
yeah, I would say it was like, at least in terms of our history of reporting, it was a bigger jump. I have, and like, that's actually a really good question, is I need to look out over the greater industry too, which I haven't, to see if everybody's registered that same jump. And a lot of it is just because we've been offering the product more broadly, DDoS mitigation. So it makes sense that we would see, a corresponding rise in attacks. Once you have a solution out there, you tend to, you get more of those customers.
Yes.
So for us, yes, it was a very big jump.
Yeah, in your report, I read over. You noted that telecommunication companies were getting the brunt of this new wave of DDoS attacks, with around 50% of the total attack volume, meaning over 37,000 attacks in just the first half of 2023. Is there something specific about telecom that makes it such a juicy target for these types of attack vectors?
Yeah, so there's sort of two things wrapped up in here. Is that telecom's always a juicy target for attacks because it's, especially if you want to take down multiple targets at once, obviously take down what is upstream of that, which is the provider,
Yes,
so if you have if you have a provider that is serving multiple banks or media companies, doesn't matter, pick your poison. It is, it's easier to take down the single point above that than all those. And then there is a little bit of bias in reporting too, because we do serve other telecom providers. And so we just might not have the granular detail under that telecom provider who was specifically being targeted under there. So
that makes sense.
A combination of both.
Yeah. And it just was interesting to me because we've talked to a lot of people who talk about infrastructure or healthcare or finance, but yeah, if you're hitting telecom, then you're able to make your blast radius a lot larger, I imagine. Yeah.
Shotgun pattern versus sniper pattern.
Right. So you mentioned in your report that the DDoS attacks have more than one use for cyber criminals, and some of that I had not necessarily heard before. You said it might be desire to collect a ransom, and specifically saying like, we can make this stop if you give us this amount of money, or it could be just a series of disruptive opening salvos, just testing to see how easy it is to shut down a target's operation, essentially doing sort of a vicious form of pen testing or red teaming or something like that. So as you stated in your report, DDoS attacks are always deliberate. And if you're in any sort of industry that requires you to be online every second of every day, which at this point is most of them, these disruptions in service outages can be deadly to your overhead, or even in the case of Medicare, healthcare sector, someone's life. So, how does you mentioned the AI-based attacks were largely responsible for the sort of the quantity of them, because you have, and I think this sort of comes back to what we were talking about before, that like the complexity of the problem has jumped up recently because of this sort of like automated processing. Can you talk more about how that works and how that makes these attacks easier and faster to spin up and execute?
Sure. So, well, on the easier and faster to execute part, you can go to, it's not just going to the dark web anymore or things like that. There's a variety of websites that you can easily go to and just .NET for use that's guaranteed to generate up, X amount of traffic, and it's relatively cost effective too. You're talking maybe 50 or a couple $100 an hour, even for a pretty large attack, versus the damage it causes on the other side, which is, potentially millions of dollars. So it's a very cost effective, everything comes down to a question of economics, right? So it's a very cost effective type of attack to execute that doesn't necessarily require any sort of specialized knowledge. If all you need is a credit card and an internet connection to buy a botnet and execute an attack, well, you've lowered the barrier to entry substantially, and it's very affordable. So sorry, what was the second part of your question there?
I guess just in terms of, I guess I can move that into the next question. Are there any aspects of AI fueled tools that could counteract DDoS attacks? If AI is making this, I guess the other part of the question was like, what is it about these new automated procedures that somehow makes them more complex and harder to defend against? And then I guess the second part of that is, is the prevention, is the cure, made from the sort of the affliction or whatever? Like, are there similar tools that can, have a similarly complex form of like defense that could neutralize this better than we did when we were, like you said, sort of making these filters, by hand, these bespoke filters in 2003, 2004, whatever.
Yeah. So a lot of the attacks nowadays will start as one type of attack and can shift to another type of attack, depending on, if it's being defended well against. If you start with a SYN flood, and it's obvious that, and you ratchet up that SYN flood to a couple hundred gigs and your target's still up, well, it's obvious that, they have very effective SYN flood mitigation, and that's not a good attack vector. And so they'll move automatically to a layer 7 application type of attack. We'll use the same example, an HTTP GET type of attack, and see if that's effective in taking the site down. And so in general, and I already talked about this too, is in general, a lot of the hardware mitigation devices that are there now, do cover a very broad spectrum. So I think they are keeping up with it. And same thing with a lot of the services too, is any DDoS attack service, somebody who it goes a much larger step above just having a hardware appliance and whatever version of code is loaded onto that hardware appliance to deal with something, is that with a service, you actually have real humans who are also looking at the attack traffic too, and judging back against that. I don't know, I haven't seen anything yet where there's any sort of AI defense built in. I haven't seen anything like that yet. So it might be coming out. It does sound like a pretty interesting thing to try to do, because ultimately with anything, AI is just machine learning, it's statistical analysis. So maybe there's a more interesting thing to do there with greater statistical analysis of attacks across a much broader base and figure out if there's more patterns. But I haven't seen anything particularly like that yet. Maybe there's some hardware vendors already doing
that. Could be something that the professionals of tomorrow could be working on today, or will soon be working on. So going back to just the uptick in the number of attacks, do you have any sort of data in terms of how much of this is effective? I'm assuming when we count an attack, are we counting a major disruption? Are we, or are we also sort of counting a misfire that we caught in time or something like that? Is this 100% disruptive, or are there, some in there that are being sort of stopped in one way or another before they can become a big problem?
So for our report in particular, it's pretty much all attacks that have been stopped before they cause a big problem. These are attacks that we've registered and that we know that they're attacks, but we've stopped them before they cause any major disruption. And most reports you're going to see cover both. So it's just an attack that has come in, whether or not it was mitigated instantly and didn't cause, 1 second of downtime, or whether it came in, dodged some filters and did cause some downtime. You'll usually see all that lumped in together on most DDoS reports, because it's just anything that registers as, anything that's classified as an attack.
Yep. Makes sense.
Regardless of outcome.
Okay. So, we were talking about how telecom is such a hot target because you have this sort of cluster effect of taking out other things that require telecom. Do you have any tips or advice for security professionals in telecom or, any industry? Like what should they be watching for to keep their security posture sort of ironclad against this? Like, are there tools, hardware, software that you think are being left on the table by a lot of security teams, or do you think it's people are doing what they can and it's just a matter of whether it gets through sometimes or not?
So I think probably my biggest single piece of advice would be that, for one, it's something that you can't ignore and just hope you get lucky, because it's never a question of if you will get a DDoS attack. It's just a question of when,
Yes.
Because they are so prolific. So it's, you have to be prepared, regardless.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think that preparedness includes both doing your own research on, understanding,
Yep.
understanding what all your attack vectors are, i.e. anything that's available on the public internet. You have to do a complete inventory of that, which, you can learn from something like a penetration test. What is it,
Yep.
what are your public facing properties? What is it that you should be, looking at protecting? And then the vast majority of, any sort of smaller telecom, like pretty much anybody except for the big guys, and this goes for any enterprise as well too, is investing in your own DDoS hardware mitigation or tools is ultimately a very, 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 very small piece. And you really should be looking at a service, because you're always going to have limited bandwidth. To wherever your web servers are, even if they're on AWS, there are going to be a finite amount of resources that either monetarily or physically you're going to be able to devote to that. And having a service that can scale to handle those attacks is going to be huge. And plus, you're buying a lot of knowledge with a service as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I had a friend who asked about the safest possible way to do an online business or whatever. And I told our company, and they're like, just use the in the box, the big online shopping things are huge for a reason. It's because they're safe as heck, so.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. You use those services. They exist for a reason. And unless you're some absolute giant like Google or something, you're not you are not going to be able to, there's going to be a limit to whatever size or complexity of attack you're going to be able to mitigate on your own.
Right. Yeah, totally. So, I want to sort of tilt this a little bit towards the career advice. I mean, we've been talking about sort of the different points along the way where, whether you're the person that's seeing the DDoS attack coming in, or whether you're the person that's writing the code or the filters to sort of mitigate against it, or you're the security architect. What are some, as you watch these things become more complex and more multifaceted, what do you have any sort of advice for people getting into the industry now to be able to sort of keep at the same sort of speed of learning that all these sort of new attacks are coming in? Like what do you recommend in terms of keeping one step ahead of the latest progress on these topics?
That's a really good question. Because I feel like it is so it is a much bigger world out there.
Yeah.
Always start with the basics. If you're getting specifically into cybersecurity and want to learn more about DDoS, start with the basics. Learn a lot about networking, especially TCP, IP networking.
There you go.
Understand your basics, all of your packet headers, how the three-way handshake works, how the closed handshake works, and then take that the next step and understand, how a web server processes requests, what the limitations are on how many requests it's going to process. Really, I would always start with the basics. You're never going to be served wrong by understanding the foundations of the internet, because it's those exact things that are exploited to cause these attacks. So even if you were super knowledgeable on TCP, and you didn't know anything about DDoS and had to see an attack for the first time, you would still recognize it and you would understand what was going on relatively quickly as long as you had those foundational elements down. Yeah. So that would be like my biggest piece of advice as far as keeping up with like, what's in vogue as far as current attacks and things like that. Definitely read the DDoS attacks reports that Zayo, for example, puts out, because we see a lot of attacks. We see the latest, greatest attacks because we're a telecom provider and we offer service. So read the reports we put out. That will give you a lot of like the latest, greatest, and also just, doing your own bit of research out there to see like, what are the botnets available? You can just Google and see, and just sort of get a rough idea of, okay, well, these are the most easily searchable botnets. These are the type of attacks they could do. What kind of attacks do you think are going to get executed most frequently? Right.
Yeah. I was going to ask if there were any kind of like case studies in terms of this was a particularly nefarious thing that happened, and this is like the steps that they went through. I mean, because I know some people of certain type of learning want to see like all the steps as they were sort of deployed like that. Is that something that comes up in the reports like that?
It's not in our reports, and that's actually a really good question. The mitigation companies tend to be pretty like tight-lipped about this kind of stuff because it's always a race of, it's like anything. It's a race between attacker and defender, right? So everybody wants to keep their secrets in that little dance that happens.
Now, to that end, I guess if you're looking to get into this particular type of work and this it's not just cybersecurity, but this very focused type of sort of network security and so forth. Like, what are some things that you could do before you had your first job that you could sort of show, because we always talk about like, do capture the flags, report on them, write your own sort of like hypotheses or publish things on your blog or whatever. Are there certain things you could do, around this where you could sort of like simulate a DDoS and how you would sort of, like, are there ways to sort of demonstrate it to a potential employer?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like you could do any of this on your own. So one thing, this is pre your first job. You can always go do something like get your JNCIE or Juniper network certification to really learn it. Cisco has an equivalent thing. So does Arista, to really learn how networking works, and then pick up, there's a million great tutorials on the internet. Pick up any programming language. Learn how to generate some very basic network requests in it. Create your own attacks.
And then document.
Yeah. So that's, I would say, everything, the network certification processes do cost money, but there are also tons of free resources where you can go out there. You can learn about networking on your own. But doing your own attack defense is a great way to learn. And, if you want to get really into it, you can start writing, C code, lower level code, generating your own packets. You can generate your own packet headers. Then that's how you get really into the details of how this would work and how you can possibly create like new and interesting attacks. That some people do. So you could easily demonstrate that for a potential employer. And back in the day, that is certainly how we found a lot of our best employees were, people who were playing with this stuff on their own.
Yeah, I was going to say, are there particular things you're looking for if you're looking through a pile of resumes? Like what are some indications that, a person, even if they don't have a lot of experience, has a similar sort of mental wavelength that you think you could, work with in an entry position like that?
It is that combination of networking and software skills. And I think that that's something that a lot of people who are focused on security don't necessarily invest in enough. Because they're like, oh, well, I'm getting the security cert, or I'm looking at exactly how to implement this firewall. They're looking at very specific things rather than those foundational skills, because those are the building blocks you need to do anything. Like I said, if you have those two skill sets really down, you don't need to know anything about how DDoS works. You're already most of the way there. All you need is the specifics to fill in the gaps.
Yeah. That's awesome. Okay, that's some great advice. So we're going to wrap up with that. But before we go today, we talked about it a little bit, but tell our listeners more about Zayo and the services you provide, and if you have any big sort of projects or initiatives coming up that you'd like to talk about, or just talk about like what you do and what you like about it.
Yeah. So in terms of a little bit about Zayo, Zayo is one of the biggest fiber providers in the US. We have 17.3 fiber miles. And so, or 17.3 million. It would help if I fixed the million to that fiber miles.
17 miles.
17 whole miles of fiber. No, 17.3 million miles of fiber, which is in the US, Canada, and in Europe. So that's a lot.
That is a lot.
We're also like the number 3 provider of SD-WAN services, even though we're not typically recognized for that. And we're the number 8 ISP on the KIDA rankings, which is something that people tend to forget about too. So we have a really big internet service provider business, which is why we see all these DDoS attacks, is because we provide internet for an incredible number of people and businesses. And so one of the things that I really enjoy about Zayo in particularly is I like working with infrastructure. And that's not something that I feel like, especially like a lot of graduates or people new to the profession get to do anymore. You're so removed from the infrastructure. It's like, oh, well, I just use an AWS service to do this. So I just use an AWS Lambda function to run this bit of code. Like you're very removed from infrastructure. And that's been, pretty much my entire career is working with, big infrastructure deployments. And you really get to, the fiber is the veins and artery of the internet. That's where everything runs through. So I think it's really important to be in touch with that sort of, with the critical infrastructure that runs everything.
Love that. So one last question for all the marbles. If our listeners want to learn more about Anna Claiborne or Zayo, where should they go online? And especially if they want to read some of Zayo's reports and some of this sort of supplemental information that you mentioned.
Yes. So as always, you can go to www.zayo.com. The report doesn't have such a specific URL, but maybe we can post that alongside the podcast episode. Sure. So we'll have the URL to the report. And then also for anyone who's curious about me on LinkedIn, just Anna Claiborne on LinkedIn. I think it's like /Anna.Claiborne, actually, if you just go to linkedin.com. So
perfect. Our listeners like to meet new people on LinkedIn. So I want to make sure that they know that they can contact you.
Yeah, I love to meet new people on LinkedIn. And I'm also always happy to help anyone out earlier in their career with advice or resources, because I know how tough it can be sometimes, especially in the infrastructure world, to break in, because it is it's a small industry and it's tough.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you were able to make it slightly less tough today, Anna. Thank you so much for joining me today. It was a real pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I really enjoyed it.
And as always, like to thank all of you who have been listening to and watching the Cyberwork podcast this year on a massive scale. We're really glad to have you along for the ride. But before we go, as always, I want to invite you to visit infosecinstitute.com/free to get a whole bunch of free stuff for Cyberwork listeners. This includes our security awareness training series, Work Bites, which features a host of fantastical employees, including a zombie, a vampire, a princess, and a pirate, making security mistakes and hopefully learning from them while working together. Also visit infosecinstitute.com/free for your free cybersecurity talent development ebook. It's got in-depth training plans for the 12 most common roles, including SOC analyst, penetration tester, cloud security engineer, information risk analyst, privacy manager, secure coder, and more. Plenty to see, plenty to do. Just get to infosecinstitute.com/free. And yes, the link will be in the description below. So keep it there first, infosecinstitute.com/free. Thank you once again to Anna Claiborne and Zayo. And thank you all so much for watching and listening. And as always, we will talk to you next week. Take care now.